It was 11:30 on a Saturday morning when Victoria Hartwell walked up to me at her husband's wake and called me a homewrecker in front of 200 people. We were standing in the main hall of the Riverside Country Club, surrounded by Philadelphia's wealthiest families, everyone dressed in black and whispering about poor Victoria and her cheating husband. She'd been crying all morning, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, accepting hugs from friends who kept telling her how strong she was. Then she spotted me near the back of the room and her whole demeanor changed. She marched straight toward me, her heels clicking on the marble floor, and said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear that I was the woman who destroyed her marriage, that I should be ashamed to show my face, that I'd stolen 23 years of her life. I stood there frozen while the room went silent. Every eye turned toward me. I felt my face burn red. I wanted to disappear. But I stayed because I figured she was right. I was the other woman. I deserved whatever she wanted to say. What I didn't know was that in exactly 45 minutes, when the lawyer read Thomas Hartwell's will, Victoria's perfectly rehearsed grief would shatter into something nobody in that room would ever forget. I'm Amanda Richardson. I'm 39 years old, and I'd been Thomas Hartwell's mistress for 7 years. He was 62 when he died of a stroke 3 days ago. We met at a charity auction in 2018, where I was working as an event coordinator. Thomas was there representing his investment firm, the kind of guy who could write a check for $50,000 without blinking. We started talking during the silent auction, ended up having drinks after, and before I knew it, he was asking if I wanted to have dinner the following week. He told me he was married but unhappy. Said Victoria cared more about social status than their actual relationship. Said they slept in separate bedrooms and barely spoke unless they were at some society function. I should have walked away. I'd never been the type to get involved with a married man. But Thomas was different. He was kind and funny, and he listened when I talked. He made me feel like I mattered. So I said yes to dinner. Then I said yes to seeing him again. And again, until 7 years had passed, and I was completely in love with someone I could never really have. Our relationship was careful, structured. He'd text me on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, meet me at my apartment in Center City around 6. We'd order takeout, watch movies, talk about our days. He never stayed the night, never missed a holiday with Victoria. Never promised to leave her. I knew what I was signing up for. I knew I was the secret, the escape, the woman he'd never choose over his real life. But I loved him anyway. I loved the way he'd rest his hand on my knee while we watched TV. I loved how he'd bring me coffee from my favorite place, even though it was 20 minutes out of his way. I loved that he knew I hated mushrooms and loved old detective novels and got anxious in crowds. For 7 years, I'd convinced myself that being his part-time something was better than being nobody's anything. When he died, I didn't expect to be invited to the funeral. I figured Victoria would ban me from everything. But Thomas's secretary called me the day after he passed and said Thomas had specifically requested my presence in his final arrangements. She said there'd be a wake at the country club followed by a reading of the will, and my name was on the list. I almost didn't go. The thought of facing Victoria, of seeing Thomas's family, of standing in a room full of people who'd judge me for what I was, made me physically sick, but I owed Thomas that much. So I put on the only black dress I owned that seemed appropriate, drove to the country club, and tried to make myself invisible in the back of the room. Victoria's performance that morning was flawless. She stood near the entrance greeting guests, her face a mask of dignified sorrow. She wore a black Chanel suit that probably cost more than my rent. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was perfect. She was the picture of the devoted wife destroyed by betrayal. People kept approaching her, squeezing her hands, telling her how sorry they were. She'd nod gracefully and say something about how Thomas had been a wonderful man despite his flaws, how she'd loved him anyway, how she'd always known he struggled with temptation. She was painting herself as the saint, and him as the sinner, and everyone was buying it. I watched from across the room, feeling smaller by the minute. This was her world. These were her people. I didn't belong here. I was the outsider, the mistake, the woman who'd helped a good man betray his vows. At least that's what everyone thought. That's what I thought. Then Victoria saw me. Her eyes locked onto mine from 50 feet away. I saw her expression change. The grief disappeared. What replaced it was pure rage. She excused herself from the group she'd been talking to and started walking toward me with purpose. My heart started pounding. I wanted to run. But where would I go? Everyone was watching now. They'd seen her spot me. They knew something was about to happen. She stopped 3 feet in front of me, close enough that I could smell her perfume. Something expensive and floral that made my head hurt. She looked me up and down with obvious disgust. Then she said, "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here." I didn't respond. What could I say? She continued, louder now, making sure everyone could hear. "You're the reason my husband is dead. The stress of maintaining your sordid little affair, the guilt of betraying his family, the shame of throwing away 23 years of marriage for some cheap fling. It killed him. And you have the audacity to show up at his wake like you have any right to mourn him." I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I wouldn't let them fall. Not here. Not in front of her. She kept going. She said I'd destroyed her life, that I'd stolen her husband, that I was a homewrecker and a whore, and every other word she could think of to make me feel as small as possible. People were staring. Some looked sympathetic toward her. Some looked disgusted by me. Nobody said anything. Nobody defended me. Why would they? In their eyes, she was the victim. When she finally finished her speech, she turned her back on me and walked away, rejoining her circle of friends who immediately wrapped her in supportive hugs. I stood there shaking, wanting to disappear into the floor. I should have left right then, should have walked out and never looked back. But something made me stay. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the memory of Thomas asking me to be there. Maybe it was just stubbornness. Whatever it was, I stayed. At noon, the lawyer called everyone into the conference room for the reading of the will. This was Thomas's attorney, Richard Brennan, a man in his 70s who'd worked with Thomas for 30 years. He was carrying a thick leather folder and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. Serious, but also something else. Something almost like satisfaction. Everyone filed into the conference room. It was a formal space with a long mahogany table and chairs for about 30 people. Victoria sat at the head of the table, flanked by Thomas's 2 adult children from his first marriage, Eric and Jennifer, both in their 30s. Thomas's brother Daniel sat nearby with his wife. Various other family members and close friends filled the remaining seats. I stayed near the back, trying to blend into the wallpaper. Richard opened the folder and began with the standard legal language. Last will and testament of Thomas Edward Hartwell, dated March 15th, 2025. Sound mind and body. Revocation of all previous wills, the usual stuff. People looked bored. Victoria had her grief mask back on, probably expecting to hear that she'd inherited everything and could continue her life of country club lunches and charity galas. Then Richard's tone changed. He said, "Before I distribute the assets," Thomas included a statement he wanted read aloud to everyone present. This is highly unusual, but he was very specific about this requirement. He cleared his throat and started reading. Thomas's words, in Richard's voice, filled the room. He said, "To everyone gathered here, I want you to understand that this will is not just about money or property. It's about truth. For the past 5 years, I've watched my wife Victoria present herself as a devoted partner while systematically betraying and robbing me. I've collected evidence. I've documented everything. And now, after my death, I want the truth exposed so that nobody continues to be fooled by her performance." The room went dead silent. Victoria's face went white. She said, "What is this? What is he talking about?" But Richard kept reading. Thomas detailed how he'd first suspected Victoria of cheating in 2020. How he'd hired a private investigator who'd confirmed she'd been having an affair with a man named Marcus Chen, a doctor she'd met at a medical fundraiser. How the affair had continued for over 10 years. How there'd been others, too. At least 3 different men over the course of their marriage. Richard pulled out photographs from the folder. Pictures of Victoria with Marcus. Victoria with another man at a hotel. Victoria kissing someone in a parking garage. He passed them around the table. Victoria's face went from white to red. She said, "This is insane. He's lying. He's making this up to justify what he did to me." but her voice was shaking. Her hands were trembling. Eric and Jennifer were staring at the photos with shocked expressions. Daniel looked like he'd been slapped. Richard continued reading. Thomas explained how he'd discovered Victoria had been stealing from him. She'd convinced him years ago to give her power of attorney over certain accounts, claiming she wanted to be more involved in managing their wealth. Instead, she'd systematically moved money into offshore accounts he didn't control. Over 8 years, she'd transferred nearly $16 million. Richard pulled out bank statements, wire transfer records, documents showing the paper trail of theft. He passed those around too. Victoria stood up from her chair. She said, "Stop this right now. This is slander. This is defamation. I'll sue you. I'll sue all of you." But Richard ignored her and kept reading. Thomas detailed how he'd found emails between Victoria and her divorce attorney. She'd been planning to divorce him the moment he retired, which was supposed to happen in 6 months. The emails discussed strategy, how to maximize her settlement, how to paint him as unfaithful and cruel, how to ensure she got the house, the cars, the country club membership, everything that mattered to her social status. She'd been counting down the days until she could leave him and take half of everything he'd built. Richard pulled out printed emails, screenshots of text messages, a whole file of correspondence that proved Victoria had been planning her exit for at least 2 years. He said Thomas had filed all this evidence with the court before his death. Everything was documented. Everything was legal. If Victoria tried to contest the will, she'd be fighting against a mountain of proof of her fraud and adultery. The room was in chaos now. People were talking over each other. Thomas's children were demanding answers from Victoria. His brother was staring at her with disgust. Victoria was trying to defend herself, her voice getting louder and more desperate. She kept saying Thomas had driven her to it, that he'd betrayed her first, that she'd only done what she had to do to protect herself. But nobody was listening anymore. The photos and documents were being passed from hand to hand. Everyone could see the truth right there in black and white. Then Richard got to the part about asset distribution. He said Thomas had restructured his estate 6 months ago, after he'd finished gathering all the evidence against Victoria. The house in Bryn Mawr would go to his children, Eric and Jennifer, to be split between them. His investment portfolio, worth approximately $42 million, would be divided as follows: $5 million to Eric, $5 million to Jennifer, $2 million to his brother Daniel, $1 million each to various charities he'd supported over the years. Victoria was doing math in her head. I could see her face calculating. That left about $28 million unaccounted for. She said, and the rest comes to me, as his wife. That's the law. Richard looked at her with something close to pity. He said, "No, Victoria. Thomas left you exactly what Pennsylvania law requires he leave you. Under state law, a spouse cannot be completely disinherited. So you'll receive $50,000 and the right to remain in the Bryn Mawr house for 6 months while you find alternative housing. After that, the property transfers to Eric and Jennifer." Victoria's mouth fell open. She said, $50,000? That's it? That's impossible. I'm his wife. I'm entitled to half of everything. Richard shook his head. He said Pennsylvania law allows a spouse to be largely disinherited if there's documented evidence of adultery or economic misconduct. Thomas provided extensive evidence of both. You can contest this in court if you choose, but I'll warn you that doing so will make all of this evidence public record. Every photograph, every bank statement, every email planning your divorce, it will all become part of the public court documents. Thomas suspected you wouldn't want that. Victoria looked like she might pass out. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. She said, "Where did the rest of the money go? If I didn't get it, who did?" Richard turned and looked directly at me. He said, "Thomas left the remainder of his estate, approximately $28 million, to Amanda Richardson." His voice carried across the room. Every head turned to look at me. I felt my heart stop. $28 million. To me, that couldn't be real. That couldn't be possible. Richard pulled out another document. He said, "Thomas left a letter explaining his decision. Would you like me to read it?" Victoria screamed, "No! This is fraud. This is conspiracy. You're all working together to steal from me." But Richard ignored her outburst and started reading anyway. Thomas wrote, I'm leaving the bulk of my estate to Amanda because she was the only person in my life who was honest with me. She never pretended to be something she wasn't. She never lied to me about her feelings or her intentions. She never stole from me or plotted behind my back. She loved me for who I was, not for what I could give her. In the 7 years we were together, she never asked me for money, never demanded I leave my wife, never tried to control me or manipulate me. She was simply there, offering genuine affection and companionship, expecting nothing in return. That kind of honesty is rare. It's worth more than any amount of money. But since money is what I have to give, I'm giving it to her. I hope she uses it to build a life that makes her happy. She deserves happiness more than anyone I've ever known. I felt tears streaming down my face. I couldn't stop them. Thomas had done this. He'd known what Victoria would do at the wake. He'd known she'd humiliate me in front of everyone. He'd set it up perfectly so that when the truth came out, everyone would see exactly who she really was. They'd see her attack me as the homewrecker, then watch as the evidence proved she'd been the real betrayer all along. It was brilliant. It was cruel. It was justice. Victoria was losing it completely now. She was screaming at Richard, at her stepchildren, at anyone who'd listen. She said she'd fight this in court. She'd prove the evidence was fake. She'd expose Amanda as a gold digger who'd seduced a dying man. But Eric cut her off. He said, "Enough, Victoria. We've all seen the proof. We know what you did. You don't get to play victim anymore." Jennifer nodded in agreement. She said, "Dad protected us from you. He made sure you couldn't take everything he built and waste it on your boyfriends and your shopping addiction. You're lucky he left you anything at all." Daniel stood up and said to Victoria, "You need to leave. This is family business now, and you're not family. Not anymore." Victoria looked around the room desperately, searching for one person who'd defend her. Nobody met her eyes. The friends who'd been consoling her earlier were avoiding her gaze. The sympathy had evaporated. They'd all seen the evidence. They all knew what she'd done. She'd played them as much as she'd played Thomas. Victoria grabbed her purse and stormed out of the conference room, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the building. Nobody went after her. Richard continued with the rest of the will, detailing specifics about property transfers and trust management. I barely heard any of it. My mind was reeling. $28 million. A letter from Thomas, telling the world I was the only honest person in his life. Vindication in front of everyone who'd watched Victoria call me a homewrecker just an hour earlier. After the reading concluded, people started filing out of the conference room. Several of them stopped to speak to me. Eric shook my hand and said his father had talked about me, that he'd known I made his dad happy, that he was glad Thomas had found some genuine companionship in his last years. Jennifer hugged me and said she was sorry for what Victoria had put me through. Daniel told me Thomas had been smart to protect his assets from Victoria's greed. One by one, the people who'd watched me get humiliated at the wake came up and offered apologies or support. The narrative had flipped completely. I'd gone from homewrecker to victim of Victoria's manipulation in the span of 1 hour. Richard asked me to stay behind after everyone else left. When the room was empty, he handed me a sealed envelope. He said Thomas had left this for me personally, separate from the will. He'd wanted me to read it alone. I took the envelope with shaking hands. Richard said he'd be in touch about the trust setup and asset transfers, that it would take a few weeks to process everything. But the money was legally mine, and Victoria had no claim to it. Then he left me alone in the conference room. I opened the envelope. Inside was a 3-page letter in Thomas's handwriting. His familiar script that I'd seen on birthday cards and notes he'd leave on my kitchen counter. The letter started with an apology. He said he was sorry for putting me through Victoria's attack at the wake. He said he'd planned it that way intentionally, because he wanted everyone to see her true nature. He wanted them to watch her perform as the grieving widow, attack me as the villain, and then have the truth expose her as the real betrayer. He said it was manipulative, and he felt guilty about it. But he couldn't think of any other way to ensure people understood who Victoria really was. He explained that he'd known about her affairs for 5 years, that he'd hired investigators and collected evidence, that he'd discovered the financial theft 2 years ago, and had been quietly moving assets to protect them. He said he'd stayed in the marriage because leaving would have triggered the divorce she'd been planning, would have given her half of everything before he could protect it. So he'd played the long game, stayed married, let her think she was getting away with it, and prepared for his death by restructuring everything to ensure she got as little as possible. He wrote about me, about how I'd been the only genuine relationship in his life, how our Tuesday and Thursday dinners had been the only times he felt like himself, how I'd never judged him or demanded more than he could give, how I'd loved him without conditions or expectations. He said he'd wanted to leave Victoria and be with me properly, but he'd been too afraid of what the divorce would cost him financially and socially. He'd been a coward. He knew that. He hoped I could forgive him. The letter ended with instructions. He said I should take the money and build a life that made me happy. Leave Philadelphia if I wanted. Start over somewhere new. Find someone who could love me openly instead of in secret. He said I deserved more than he'd given me, and the money was his way of trying to make up for all the years I'd spent waiting for him. He said he loved me. He said he was sorry. He said he hoped I'd remember him kindly despite everything. I sat in that empty conference room and cried until I couldn't cry anymore. Not tears of sadness exactly, more like release. 7 years of being the secret. 7 years of canceled plans and lonely holidays. 7 years of loving someone who couldn't choose me, and in the end, he'd chosen me anyway, in the only way he could. By giving me his fortune and exposing the truth about Victoria to everyone who mattered. The next few weeks were surreal. Richard handled the estate transfers. The $28 million was moved into a trust in my name. Victoria tried to contest the will, but her lawyers advised her that going to court would only make things worse. The evidence Thomas had filed was airtight. If she fought it publicly, every society page in Philadelphia would run stories about her affairs and her theft. She'd be ruined socially, which was the only thing she really cared about. So she took her $50,000 and moved out of the Bryn Mawr house. Last I heard, she was living with Marcus Chen in a condo in Rittenhouse Square. The friends who'd consoled her at the wake had stopped returning her calls. I stayed in Philadelphia for 6 months, tying up loose ends and figuring out what to do next. Thomas's children reached out a few times. We had coffee once. They said they were glad their father had someone who cared about him, even if it was complicated. They didn't blame me for the affair. They blamed Victoria for driving him to it. I appreciated their kindness even though I didn't fully believe I deserved it. Eventually, I decided to leave. Philadelphia had too many memories, too many reminders of what I'd been. I wanted to start fresh somewhere nobody knew my story. I sold my apartment and moved to Charleston, South Carolina. Bought a house near the water, with a porch and a garden. I'd always wanted a garden, but my apartment balcony had been too small. Now I have room for roses and tomatoes and herbs. Stupid little things that make me happy. I volunteer at a literacy center 3 days a week, teaching adults to read. I've made friends who know me as Amanda, the woman who moved here from up north, not Amanda the mistress who inherited millions. I date occasionally. Nothing serious yet. I'm not sure I'm ready for serious. 7 years with Thomas taught me I'm capable of loving someone deeply, but it also taught me I deserve someone who can love me openly. Sometimes I think about Victoria, about how she'd spent years playing the victim while actively destroying her marriage from the inside, about how she'd stolen millions and cheated repeatedly while publicly maintaining her image as the devoted wife, about how she'd called me a homewrecker in front of 200 people, so sure of her moral high ground, and about how spectacularly that had backfired when the truth came out. Thomas had been 10 steps ahead of her the entire time. He'd known she'd attack me at the wake. He'd counted on it. He'd structured the will reading to immediately follow her performance, ensuring maximum impact when the evidence was revealed. He'd wanted everyone to see her exactly as she was, stripped of her carefully crafted image. And it had worked perfectly. In 1 hour, she'd gone from sympathetic widow to exposed fraud. Her reputation, the thing she valued most, had been destroyed by her own words. I don't take pleasure in her downfall exactly, but I can't say I feel bad about it either. She'd built her entire life on lies and manipulation. She'd stolen from Thomas while making him feel guilty for finding comfort elsewhere. She'd planned to divorce him and take half his wealth after making him believe she'd forgiven his affair. She'd used me as the villain in her story while being a bigger villain herself. Thomas had simply made sure the truth came out, that people saw who she really was before she could rewrite the narrative. Today, 3 years later, I'm 42 years old, and I live in a blue house on the water in Charleston. I wake up when I want. I spend my days reading and gardening and helping people learn to read. I have enough money that I'll never have to worry about bills or rent or any of the financial stress that used to keep me up at night. I'm not hiding anymore. I'm not anyone's secret. I'm just Amanda, living a quiet life by the ocean, trying to figure out what happiness looks like when you're not waiting for someone else to give it to you. Sometimes I walk down to the water at sunset and think about Thomas, about how he'd loved me in his limited way, about how he'd tried to make things right even though he'd run out of time, about how he'd given me not just money but validation, proof that what we had was real even if it couldn't be public. I hope he's at peace. I hope he knows I don't regret loving him, even with all the complications. He taught me I was capable of deep feeling. He taught me I deserved honesty. And in the end, he taught me that sometimes justice takes the long way around, but it gets there eventually. Victoria lost everything she cared about because she thought she was smarter than everyone else. She thought she could steal and cheat and lie and still maintain her position as the wronged wife. She thought she'd humiliated me at the wake, destroyed my reputation, made me the villain in her story. What she didn't know was that Thomas had seen through her years ago, that he'd documented everything, that he'd planned for exactly this scenario, that he'd left me the proof and the money and the last word. She'd called me a homewrecker. Turns out she'd wrecked her own home just fine without any help from me. And when the truth came out, when everyone saw what she really was, there was no coming back from that. No amount of tears or excuses could rebuild the image she'd spent decades constructing. Thomas had made sure of that. I finish my coffee on the porch and watch the sun set over the harbor. The sky turns pink and orange and gold. It's beautiful here. Peaceful. I've built something real with the second chance Thomas gave me. Not just financially, but emotionally. I've learned that love doesn't have to be secret to be valid, that honesty matters more than convenience, that sometimes the person everyone thinks is the villain is just someone who loved imperfectly and got caught in someone else's much bigger lie. Would I do it differently if I could go back? I don't know. Probably. The affair hurt people, including me, but I can't change the past. All I can do is live with the consequences and try to build something better going forward. Thomas gave me the resources to do that. He gave me the truth that set me free from Victoria's narrative. And he gave me the example of someone who planned carefully, waited patiently, and made sure justice happened even from beyond the grave. The sunset fades to twilight. I go inside and make dinner. Tomorrow I'm meeting a friend for lunch and then heading to the literacy center. Simple plans. Honest plans. The kind of life I never thought I'd have when I was spending Tuesday and Thursday nights in a Center City apartment waiting for a married man to show up. That woman feels like someone else now. Someone younger and more hopeful and more willing to accept scraps of affection. I'm not that woman anymore. I'm someone who learned that sometimes the biggest revenge is just living well, being honest, building a life that doesn't require lies or performance or hiding. Victoria's still in Philadelphia, still trying to repair her reputation, still dealing with the fallout from Thomas's revelations. I'm here in Charleston, watching the sunset, growing tomatoes, teaching people to read. Which one of us really won? I think Thomas knew the answer to that question. That's why he structured things the way he did. He wanted me to have this life, this peace, this freedom, and he wanted Victoria to face consequences for once in her entitled, manipulative existence. She'd called me a homewrecker at the wake. By the time the lawyer finished reading the will, everyone in that room knew the truth. She'd wrecked her own home. Thomas had just made sure everyone saw it. And me? I'd been the only honest person in the whole mess. Thomas knew it. And now everyone else did too. 1.